Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John, and I am an author, and I am coming to you here today on another Writing Wednesday to talk a little bit about some of the things I try to do or work on for the setting of my stories, both broad scope and small scope. Um, I think, the sort of setting and everything is obviously pretty important, especially with a fantasy story or something that doesn't take place in the real worlds. Of really establishing what kind of world you're working in, what kind of rules you're working on. And that's something I've sort of slowly come up with over time in my writing. It didn't, I sort of had some of these ideas initially, but sort of developed them um, more fully. Um, Sort of to give a brief overview of what I've come up with is certainly it's a fantasy stories that you know a magical world. There's a widespread use of magic um, in the world that I really like because I love the idea of sort of like magic and the ability to manipulate the elements. At its base, it's based on sort of the six basic elements: earth, wind, fire, water, light, and dark. Sort of, they're the elemental forces weave through nature. They're stronger, weak. Each one is stronger, weaker in some areas or environments, but they're all present everywhere, and that's what those capable of magecraft or spellcraft or magic. I use those terms pretty interchangeably. Um, can sort of harness and weave into spells and different groups based on I've slowly developed over the years that different groups have their own methods of spell casting and being able to do it. um Elves being, as is typical of the fantasy setting, my elves the elves in my setting have very being all of them having a natural connection to these elemental strands, which they call ere, um, and being very long lived, are very they usually do their spell weaving silently, or they're able to do it mentally just because they have so much more time to practice. um, and because of that close connection, different groups of elves tend to take on different, like they become more and more affiliated, often tend to become more and more affiliated with an element or one or two elements in combination. And because I really, one of my big things is that sort of magic effects, or magic, or these elemental strands affect anything, they start taking on the characteristics of that element. So like in my first book, The Shadow of the Path, there's a forest elf group. They're very connected with earth magic in particular and the forest, but they start taking on characteristics as they get older of becoming you know more like bark like or tree like. And rather than being just truly immortal, I mean, they don't, just like in other things, they, as is common in the setting, elves don't die a natural death per se, but as they get older and older, they start sort of, once they get old enough, they start, somewhere around, it depends upon the elf, somewhere around 1500 to 2000 years of age. If they're not killed by something in the meantime, they tend to what I call fade, where they start increasingly taking on the characteristics and become, say, for the forest elves, basically they turn into like a living tree, more or less. They don't just go on forever, and different groups have different forms of that. um Dwarves, unlike some, dwarves do practice magic, but that's a lot more around like their magic is, they utilize for spell weaving like carvings and runes, and a lot of that goes into their crafting, although they do use it in battle as well. Humans being short lived, tend to use sort of to help them, and they have so much less time to practice. Humans tend to hold, rather than, they can learn how to, especially simpler spells, they can learn how to, you know, weave, weave spells more, more simple spells mentally, but they tend to use things like incantations and spoken verbal spells as sort of a, as an aid to crafting and forming, magic. Those with a sufficiently powerful connection with the elemental forces or with magic do gain, longer and healthier lives, to the point of being, practically immortal unless something kills them. I also really wanted to set things in, to sort of explore different ideas and set things in different areas. Um, that this is a that each this is a universe or a creation of multiple worlds that I call Terra, that are sort of, little bubbles separated by like vast expanses of sort of the natural elements. Extremely powerful mages I call Terra Magi, as in mages that have enough power and connection to magic, or the elemental forces, that they can literally cast spells that can affect whole continents, whole Terra at a time, have the ability to, you know have enough control that they can, open a portal from one Terra to another. So it's, in my world, it's sort of, the typical fantasy, roughly medieval. My sort of thought on that is, some worlds, for one reason or another, get more, you know, might be a little more, a little less technically advanced, or some regions. But sort of my idea is that, and what I came up with for my setting was basically that magic solves. Not everyone has magic, but magic is common enough and solves enough problems that developing sort of more modern technology has never really been necessary most of the time. I might eventually create, maybe a terror or a society here or there that does use, machines. And in fact, I have one that does, one group or society, that's featured in my second book, that does, we don't see a lot of it, but sort of, to sort of aid themselves. They were an entire race of incredibly powerful mages, um, that sort of tend to craft sort of magical tech, to sort of, that, magic is so universal for them that they do sort of develop more magical tech to help themselves out, because that's a level playing field for all of them. So there's not like, a select group of mages that can solve problems and stuff, but they move between Terra. Introduced a little bit in the third book I'm writing, and will become more important, as there's also sort of different dimensions, sort of, around the mortal plane, basically. Some of them inhabited by gods, some of them inhabited by demons. I'm pretty sure I'm going to call them realms. Terra are different planets, basically. Some of them have different sizes. They're, the Terra have different sizes, different, some of them have, might have more than one sun. There's definitely, I've already, the Terra that take the my second book takes place on, has more than one moon. I think I've mentioned in my third book too that there's more than one moon. But same thing, the, each of the Terra have gods, which are sort of the spirits or personifications, or, of the different like elements or different forces on the Terra they're attached to. They're sort of part of the spirit or the life force of the whole world. So, they basically, while their Terra exists, they can't be killed, or if they would be killed, It would absolutely devastate, the Terra they're attached to. Although they can be, defeated and imprisoned and depowered, and or their power dispersed in various ways. But it's essentially impossible to actually kill them. But they're specific to each Terra. Some of them are, and that's sort of one of the other differences, is on some Terra, the gods just sort of, sleep or keep to themselves if they're not interested in doing anything. Others, although there's certain rules, and that's a big part of my third book, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but, there's ones where they interact a lot more with the mortals, and, accepting and drawing or doing things to try to earn their praise and worship, and sort of giving them blessings and magical or divinely empowered artifacts, and giving them aid in various ways. And that's a lot of what my third book is about, is all the problems that come with a world like that, when you have gods being incredibly powerful and stuff like that. There's all kinds of other stuff in various worlds. Some humans, elves, dwarves, all the typical fantasy races, goblins, orcs, trolls, are pretty much found on most, if not all, Terra. Whereas, there's some, either magically created or more unique that are that are less common, like the race in my second book, the Izan, that race of the whole race is just very powerfully magical, which sort of both sort of creates a unique appearance from them, and they're only natively from one Terra or one area. So that's sort of some of the ideas, are sort of broadly speaking, of what I do for my setting. Um, you know, there's other things and other details, but sort of that's my general setting. In terms of smaller setting, I like to try to, you know, magic. That's sort of my crutch, for lack of a better word. Magic is sort of like being a fantasy series. Magic is sort of the trump card for everything. Um, that's also why I've created, you know, in my world, the vast majority of societies and cultures that I've created or worked on in my world are very um, there tend to be kings and lords and dukes and all that kind of stuff, but tend to be, at least have a very balanced gender dynamic. You know, male presenting characters, female presenting characters, all have positions of power and authority. They serve as soldiers. They can be mages, and that's part of what comes down to the trump card. As I just figured, you know, in a world where, in a universe creation where magic is the trump card, the thing that is the dominant. If you have magic, you have advantages over everybody that doesn't. Not that a non-mage can't defeat a mage. There's various ways they can, but you know magic is definitely the dominant force. And if both men and women, or male or female presenting characters, are just as likely as each other to have that dominant force, have magic, that would create generally very equitable societies. Um, in terms of the worlds themselves, so far I've tended not to. I like to try to, as much as possible, like describe like the landscape and sort of the setting, and sort of make some kind of geographical or geographical sense. But again, powerful enough magic can literally rewrite the landscape, so there are differences, which is also why I have so far not drawn any maps. Both I'm not very I don't have a ton of drawing talent, so that's one of them. But also, just and maybe that's something I could try now that I'm on ADHD meds, but I never had the patience to sit down and do it properly before either. But you know And I use the excuse in my first book. There's reasons I won't go into because I don't want to spoil the plot for anyone interested in checking it out. But let's just say there's some things going on. It's a Sirana it's a Terra that's one. Basically it's one big continent and some surrounding islands and stuff like that. It's a fairly small, all things considered, a fairly small Terra, but sort of to some degree, the geography of the continent doesn't make a lot of sense due to some magical things going on. My second book, In the Shadow of the Past, while it deals with a threat to the whole world, the whole Terra, it takes place in one very geographically confined area, and sort of the overall is not hugely important. Um, and similarly, the majority of the action of my third book, When Gods Do Meddle, takes place on what I'm calling the continent of mysteries, which is dominated like there's coast settled. There's all kinds of settlements and communities and even kingdoms. Not so much, it's sort of like independent cities, small kingdoms along the coast, but the center, because of again all this divine meddling, which is what the book is about, and all these empires that at one time or another have tried to conquer the continent for its resources, or to find the various divine and magical artifacts that have been hid there, which have then in turn, when their empires have started to crumbling, hid their own or hit more divine or magical items there, that it's created that the majority of the interior of the continent is what's called everyone calls the shifting wilderness. It's basically impossible to map, and it makes a lot of sense that you can sort of navigate to it for sort of some of the larger landmarks, like roughly navigate through it with things like some of the larger landmarks like large rivers and mountains, but it's basically impossible to clearly map. And then there's some other continents that I reference, but very little of the action takes place on. Who knows? I'm still like third, maybe a little bit, maybe 40% through the book at this point. So who knows? Maybe when I'm part of the editing process, I'll be inspired to draw a map, or get somebody else to help me and draw a map for me. Um, but yeah, in terms of just to talk briefly about, that's one of the things I like. I've tried to add more on, again, try to a combination of the importance of like magic and the magical, and it's a fantasy story, and that's sort of my trump card, but I don't want to use that entirely as an excuse. So, really trying to use realistic descriptions of like landscape and what type of environments you'd find near each other, and also, ideas of like weather, like, rather than just, oh, we're traveling through winter, it's snowing, but really like, give an idea of what that looks like and feels like. The most recent couple of chapters most recent chapter I finished in my third book, my main characters are looking for something up in this mountain area, and it's sort of getting to mid to late fall, and there's like a storm coming in, and they're very aware of the fact that high up in the mountains, a fall storm is probably going to be snow, and they really want to find what they're looking for and get out of the mountains before you know, these rain clouds arrive and possibly risk snowing them in. And as they get what they're looking for and are making their way down the mountain, they do get greeted by some snow, which turns into slush, which turns into rain as they get down, further in altitude. And really, just because that's stuff I like. I don't know if it's necessary for a book to include stuff like that, but I just find it interesting to include sort of stuff like where does the sun rise and set, where do the moons rise and set, what can be seen or not seen by moonlight, is there, what are the weather patterns, or what is the weather they're dealing with like. So I've worked to sort of include that a lot more. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my rambling on sort of the setting of my books and some of the things I've looked at. I do encourage you to check them out. My first book is The Shadow of the Past. And the second is And the Sunburned Red. Both of them are available on Amazon and linked below. So what are some of the things you like to look for in, you know, on your setting? What are your thoughts on, my setting? And, do you have a particular magic system you like or dislike? Just what are your thoughts on all that? Do you think weather is important? I would love to hear your comments and feedback below. Please like, share, subscribe, leave your comments, follow my socials. They're linked below in my websites. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and that you have an opportunity to do or experience something creative. And I'll catch you on the next one.